the opening panel for the Forum on Police Violence. Of course, there's going to be actually a full day of workshops happening tomorrow. All of the workshops and stuff are free / by donation. Yeah, we really hope that this forum can sort of start a bigger dialogue in our city around these topics of police violence, because we all know that stuff that happened during the G20 was not an isolated incident, and this kind of stuff has been happening in different communities for a long time, and we need to keep the discussion going and not let the cops get rid of it. So, before I pass it off to our wonderful moderator, Daryl, maybe we want to just mention some organizations that have endorsed this forum. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers, known as Illegal Ottawa, Disability Action Movement Now, Agitate for People of Color, QP 4600, Queer Faction, Coalition Opposée à la Brutalité Policière, Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, Under Pressure Coalition Against Poverty, the Prisoners Correspondence Project, the Student Christian Movement of Ottawa, Q-Team, Prostitutes of Ottawa Work, Educate, Resist, Students Against Israeli Apartheid, the Women's Resource Center here at the University of Ottawa, Common Cause Ottawa, and the Indigenous Peoples Solidarity Movement Ottawa. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to our moderator. Daryl LaRue is a part-time professor in sociology here at the University of Ottawa. Daryl.
I just want to explain how things are going to work. Each presenter will have about 15 to 20 minutes max to give a presentation. I'll introduce each speaker before they go. And afterwards, we'll have probably anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour to have questions and discussion. So our first speaker is Jaggi Singh. He's a longtime organizer and activist. He has been involved in many groups and campaigns over the years, especially the anti-capitalist movement, CLAC in Montreal, anti-racism and migrant justice, with No One Is Illegal in Montreal as well, Indigenous solidarity and anti-police brutality. He was also the target for arrest during the recent anti-G8 and G20 protests in Toronto. So without further ado, Jaggi.
For me, I guess I want to start with some basic starting points, some basic principles, I guess, because when we talk about police violence and police repression, these aren't things that happen in a vacuum. That the police suddenly get violent on people, or there's moments when it happens and moments when it doesn't. I mean, there's structures, and I think it's important to sort of ground why the police act as they do. And I ground that in understanding that we live in a colonial context, a context that is based on dispossessing people of their land and resources, and that is a very violent process, and that is a process that requires coercion and violence, and that's incarnated by armies and the police. We live in a context of capitalism, which is also based on violence and dispossessing people and keeping people in certain stations and not in others, and the two interact to result in police violence, along with a lot of other things. This is always obscure. This is something that's made to seem not so evident, and it is evident, it is basic, but it's made to seem like it isn't. We have things like the law and courts and other things to make it seem like we're negotiating within society rather than having these things imposed on us and creating violence. There's a quote by an old French philosopher. We're quoting a lot of people in French today, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it says that the law in its majestic equality treats the rich man and the poor man equally when they steal a loaf of bread or when they sleep under a bridge. But of course, a rich man doesn't need to steal a loaf of bread and sleep under a bridge, and poor people do sometimes. And because of poverty and because of what capitalism and colonialism impose on us, there are reactions, and that becomes criminalized. And I think it's important to recognize that and recognize that the police are a necessary arm of that. They're not some neutral force. So another starting point for me in any discussion about police violence is the necessity of talking about demands, and that it's necessary to talk about abolishing the police, not reforming them, not getting them to do their job, and I'll be talking a little bit later about what doing their job really means. And sometimes people talk about community control, which I think is a stronger term than reforming the police or making the police do their job better. But I think if we ever have effective community control, that basically means we're abolishing the police. So that's an important starting point for me. And the final starting point is that all of this sort of comes together through us being involved in actual organizing experiences, sort of doing the day-to-day struggle and work. And that's a very kind of thing. Like, we're supporting people as they're confronting the system or they're dealing with police violence. That support takes different forms. building campaigns, creating public education spaces, but it's through the actual organizing that I think we conceive of these demands that actually make sense and speak to the realities of the people who are dealing with it. You know, on a daily basis, police harass, they profile, they accuse people, they injure, they assault, they intimidate, they kill. This is police impunity. In Montreal, there are over 60 people since 1987 that have been killed by the police. Any sort of attempt, when there are attempts to shed some light on what happened, is systematically undermined. Police go to courts, or they use public relations to undermine any sort of justice in these cases. They investigate themselves. It's now been revealed through sort of academic analysis, although people have lived this experience all the time, but that there is a phenomenon of racial profiling in Montreal, and in certain neighborhoods there's a disproportionate amount of people who are profiled because of their cultural background. So there's that daily police violence, and you know, Toronto has been referenced. The G20 in Toronto at least, you know, $1 billion security operation, a $5.5 million fence, 18,000 cops, a police state that basically took shape over the course of a week. Illegal searches, intimidation, and all kind of exploded on that Saturday and Sunday and Monday with mass arrests, homophobic, sexist, racist abuse of people who were detained, threats of sexual assault, people who were denied food and water and injured, over 1,000 arrests, most of whom weren't charged. And in response to this, I mentioned all of this sort of structural police stuff in one example through the G20 in Toronto and the daily stuff, as well as through Montreal, because often this is made to seem like this is atypical. You know, it's the police sort of going beyond what they're supposed to do. But it's not atypical, and I think it's important to remind ourselves of that historical role of the police and where they come from. That mass arrests and beatings and killings, or day-to-day harassment and accusing of people, particularly targeted groups, is what the police is all about. Just limiting myself to the context of the Canadian state, the formation of the federal police arises, the RCMP, which previously was called the Northwest Mounted Police, arises to deal with Métis and Indigenous rebellions in the prairies. The Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, the Ontario-Ottawa Tract, and the Regina Riot of 1935, very violent incidents. They're violent because the police attacked the labor movement of the time. We've learned recently through the Fifth Estate of a program in the 40s and 50s called ProFunk, Prominent Functionaries. It was a program run by the Canadian government to basically keep files on tens of thousands of suspected communist or communist sympathizers, with a plan, outlined plan, to detain them en masse in places like Casa Loma or prisons in the prairies. We can talk about the October crisis, where there were mass arrests of 500 people in Quebec, the Quebec General Strike and the targeting the labor movement then, Solidarity BC, where the labor movement in BC was targeted. Before the Army came into Oka in 1990, it was the SQ that raided that uprising. Gelston Lake in BC in 1995, where Native activists were targeted by the RCMP. The RCMP head of operations then talked about how smear campaigns were their specialty and used military vehicles and mines and the rest to try to quell that so-called Native rebellion. 1995 Ipperwash and the shooting death of W. George. The Queen's Park riot in 2000. I can go on and on. Six Nations in 2006. Sun Peaks, Quebec City. This is what the police do. And sometimes we're surprised by it, or at least certain sectors of society are surprised by it, like we saw in Toronto when a more privileged or relatively privileged sector of the population is exposed to this abuse. But this is something that people live day to day. We saw it concentrated in Toronto over the period of 3 or 4 days, and we were getting lots of testimonies of that abuse and violence from a lot of people, and that should be recognized and that should be dealt with. But it's something that people are dealing with day to day in our prisons and with the cops. If we look at the origins of policing, I borrow this from Jeff Shanks, who is an anarchist writer and professor. He quotes the Royal Edict of 1667 when the first modern police force was formed under Louis XIV in France. And that edict stated that the job of the police was to purge the city of what may cause disturbances, procuring abundance, and having each and every one live according to their station and duties. So this is the language of the 1660s. But purging the city of what may cause disturbances and having each and every one live according to their station and duties is about targeting the poor and the masses to make sure they maintain their place in society. And procuring abundance is linking the role of the police with pre-capitalism, or what was to become capitalism. That's 1667. So I'll fast forward a little bit to 2009, and I'll quote someone else who made his statement originally in French, but I'll quote it in English. And this is Yves Francoeur, who is the president of the Montreal Police Brotherhood, the union that represents the police. And after the shooting death, the murder of Freddie Villanueva, a youth in Montreal North in 2008, there was a lot of pressure on the police through sort of more mainstream sources to say, the police should be more sensitive. Why isn't the police chief, going to the funeral and maybe, showing condolences? And Yves Francoeur, the head of the police union, put the police chief back into line by the following quote: "Our job as police officers is repression. We don't need a social worker as chief, we need a general. After all, the police is a paramilitary organization, don't forget that." To be fair to Yves Francoeur, he's telling the truth. The word répression in French is repression in English. What he meant in French is that we deal with putting people down and going after the things that our bosses tell us to do. He's not exaggerating. That's exactly what the police do. So I think we just need to disabuse ourselves of any notion that the police are a neutral force, both historically and through what's happening contemporarily. This might be pretty obvious to folks, but I think it's sometimes good to start with the obvious and let others get into the more deeper part of the analysis. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the criminalization of dissent. What I call also now the criminalization of organizing, because it's not simply dissenting that's being criminalized, but the act of organizing and considering certain views. I guess I bring a certain perspective of the last decade or so vis-a-vis the anti-capitalist movement and the criminalization of dissent. One important proviso to make is that anytime people resist, anytime people think of resisting and organize to do so, you are criminalized. And that's escalated over the years, just in sort of my little microcosm in looking at the criminalization of dissent, because we can go from 1997 and the APEC protests in Vancouver, which some of you might remember and others probably don't remember at all, but people protested a global summit at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and the police responded by using pepper spray. There were a lot of other things that happened, but the thing that most offended people was the use of pepper spray, and that was a national scandal in 1997. It provoked a public inquiry and what have you. You fast forward to 2001, and the use of these weapons are becoming normalized. The police are sort of owning their techniques. They're starting now with having fear campaigns prior to summit so that you can sort of prepare the terrain for mass arrest, to prepare the terrain to criminalize and to exceptionalize certain protesters and define them as the bad ones and as others are the good ones because they don't do anything that's disruptive. So the use of tear gas and rubber bullets. The first time rubber bullets were used against the civilian population in Canadian history